Live from London, this is BBC News. The UK's Deputy Prime Minister resigns following an inquiry into bullying allegations. We're live in Downing Street. We'll have the key details in that report and all the latest political reaction. Over 400 now killed in fighting between rival military factions in Sudan as the international community pushes again for a ceasefire. Western allies meet in Germany to discuss further backing for Ukraine. And gone. Twitter removes the blue tick from accounts not paying a subscription fee. Hello and welcome to BBC News. We start with a huge political story here in the UK, where the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, has been forced to resign. Wherever you're watching, this is a story which touches on issues that everyone can understand, from workplace bullying to difficult or domineering bosses. Well, the investigation into the bullying allegations has been going on for months. A report was given to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, yesterday. In his resignation letter today, Dominic Raab claimed the inquiry hadn't been fair, calling it Kafkaesque, and saying the threshold for bullying was now so low it would encourage spurious complaints against ministers. Let's go straight to our political correspondent, David Wallace-Lockhart, who's there in Westminster. And David, talk about a reluctant resignation.
That's right. And now Dominic Raab had always pledged to stand down if this independent report upheld complaints of bullying against him. 2 of these complaints were upheld, and therefore Mr Raab has decided he has to stick by his word and step down. But he's clearly doing it very reluctantly. He talks about how he feels the bar for bullying has been set far too low. He talks about never having been found for raising his voice or physically intimidating anyone or throwing anything, which were some rumours that had been circling about. He was cleared of all of that, but still 2 complaints upheld. He said he had to go. A reluctant resignation. Even before we had the full report, he'd written a piece for the Telegraph newspaper, once again attacking the process broadly, as you said, calling it Kafkaesque. So he has stood down, he has left government, but clearly very unhappy at doing so.
We've had a very quick reshuffle, but there are some fundamental questions still swirling around for Rishi Sunak, the handling of this.
That's right. Now we have a man called Oliver Dowden, who's become the Deputy Prime Minister, a strong ally of Rishi Sunak for a long time. Dominic Raab held 2 positions. He was also Justice Secretary. Alex Chalk, another ally of Rishi Sunak, has taken over that position. But yeah, like you say, questions still for how the Prime Minister handled this, because we know he got this report yesterday. There wasn't a decision about Dominic Raab's future for around 24 hours after that. That's giving opposition parties the opportunity to accuse him of being weak. And of course, this isn't the first government minister, Rishi Sunak, who's not been Prime Minister for that long, has lost. He lost another 2 government ministers since taking over, one around bullying allegations, one around their tax affairs. So to lose a third now, that will be something he won't be entirely comfortable with.
David, there at Westminster, thanks for the very latest from there. It has been a dramatic first few hours of today. Let's hear from our political correspondent Ian Watson on today's events at Westminster.
Let's make him our next Prime Minister. Please welcome Rishi Sunak.
He was a close ally of the Prime Minister, a key figure in the Conservative leadership campaign. But Dominic Raab has resigned as Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary over claims that he bullied civil servants. There was a 5-month inquiry by a senior lawyer which looked at 8 formal complaints from his time at 3 government departments. The lawyer, Adam Tolley, upheld some, but not all of the allegations. So, at the former Brexit department, he said Mr Raab's conduct cannot be characterised as offensive, malicious or insulting. There was no evidence to suggest any abuse or misuse of power. But at the Foreign Office, he found he'd acted in a way which was intimidating, and which also involved an abuse or misuse of power in a way that undermines or humiliates. And at the Ministry of Justice, Mr Tolley also found that the Deputy Prime Minister acted in a manner that was intimidating. Dominic Raab described the work of some officials as utterly useless and woeful. The Prime Minister said he accepted his Deputy Prime Minister's resignation with great sadness. He even suggested there had been shortcomings in the complaints process that may have to be addressed in future. But it's very clear from Dominic Raab's resignation letter to Rishi Sunak that the now former Justice Secretary believes he was treated unjustly. He said the senior lawyer Adam Tolley had dismissed all but 2 of the claims levelled against me, and then he challenged those. He claimed that he'd been exonerated of many of the allegations about his conduct. Not once in 4.5 years, he said, had he sworn or shouted at anyone, let alone thrown anything or otherwise physically intimidated anyone, nor intentionally sought to belittle anyone. And he issued this warning: in setting the threshold for bullying so low, this inquiry has set a dangerous precedent. It will encourage spurious complaints against ministers. The Senior Civil Servants Union are calling for a new independent complaints process. But did Dominic Raab have a point about how he was treated? Isn't Dominic Raab right? The bullying threshold's been set too low and ministers can't really do their jobs if they're facing spurious complaints.
He's not right. The complaints that we were involved in were significant complaints from individuals. There were multiple instances in terms of the behaviour that people were complaining about, and they had a devastating effect on the individuals involved. This was not some spurious snowflakery. These were substantial complaints.
Since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, Sir Gavin Williamson resigned from government over bullying allegations. The Conservative Party chairman, Nadeem Zahawi, was dismissed for not being transparent over his tax affairs.
Morning.
And Labour questioning the Prime Minister's judgment in reappointing Dominic Raab to government.
What I think this shows is the continual weakness of the Prime Minister, because there's a double weakness here. He should never have appointed him in the first place, along with other members of the Cabinet that shouldn't have been appointed. And then he didn't sack him. And even today, it's Raab who resigns rather than the Prime Minister who acts.
Rishi Sunak said he'd restore integrity to the heart of government, but in the process, his political and personal alliances have come under strain. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Well, let's speak now to Rachel Cunliffe, who's Senior Associate Editor at The New Statesman. She's there in Westminster. Rachel, thanks so much for being here on the programme. I was reading your Twitter feed a little earlier in the day, and it was interesting how you were underlining just how undermining behaviour like this can actually be.
Yes, and I think that's important. Dominic Raab says in his resignation letter that the report found no evidence that he had shouted or sworn or thrown things at civil servants, as though that means that he'd never bullied them. Now, workplace bullying can come in many forms. Often it's a case not of shouting or swearing, but of undermining individuals, of setting expectations that change or that can never be met, and then harassing people for getting things wrong in front of their colleagues. There's a lot of that in the report. Colleagues being criticised in front of other civil servants. Possibly the criticisms were valid, possibly not, but that can really create a culture where people just come to work in fear. And since I tweeted those things, I've had lots and lots of comments from people working in all kinds of fields, from politics and journalism to the NHS, education, universities, all kinds of fields, all saying that this is behaviour that they recognise in their own experience.
Yes, so many people can look at a story like this. It's a political story, but it echoes with people's experience all over the world in terms of the fundamental issues. We've got your Twitter feed on the screen at the moment, but just take us through some of the things that actually have happened to you.
Well, I should say that my employer now, the New Statesman, it's a wonderful place to work, and none of these examples come from there. But I have had managers who changed their minds constantly, and when I wasn't able to preempt those changes, that was seen as my fault, told off for using a photocopier in the wrong room, really little things like that. I've also had sort of friends share experience of being told that they were taking a lunch break at the wrong time, or that they had sent an email in a slightly wrong way. Now, when you're starting out in a new job, there are all kinds of errors that you might make as you're starting to get used to that workplace. It's the role of a manager to kind of talk you through those things. And if you come to work and immediately feel terrified of ever making an error, that's obviously going to impact the quality of the work you're able to do, and therefore it's going to cause problems for the future, which does seem to be the case with a number of the civil servants that Dominic Raab did work with, that it is a self-perpetuating issue.
And we heard from the union talking about 1 in 6 civil servants having issues related to this sort of thing, and that is an alarming number if that is the case. There are so many serious questions, though, that have to be answered in terms of the way this has been handled, though. We didn't have a publication of the report initially. There's been no actual decision from the Prime Minister, and that allowed Dominic Raab 24 hours to basically undermine the whole process, didn't it?
Well, I think you can read from the fact that Dominic Raab has resigned that was, at least in part, due to pressure from the Prime Minister. I imagine if Rishi Sunak had begged him to stay, he probably would have found a way to do that. But yes, Raab published his resignation letter and indeed published his article in The Telegraph, where he says essentially that the report and what's happened to him sets a dangerous precedent for the future of governance in general. He did all of that before Rishi Sunak issued his own letter, and indeed before the report was published. So giving Raab the chance to set the agenda now there. And you do have to wonder what was going on yesterday. Rishi Sunak got this report before midday, and it was only at 10 a.m. this morning that we finally got an idea of what was going to happen.
How damaging then do you think it is for the Prime Minister, because he talked about restoring integrity to government on his first day. He's lost his Deputy Prime Minister, people making the point that these allegations were swirling around when he made that appointment as his deputy. He also lost another Cabinet Minister, Gavin Williamson, for his bad behaviour. What is your assessment in terms of how this impacts on the Prime Minister himself?
Well, let's give Rishi Sunak some credit. This has been handled a lot more swiftly than it would have been done in the Boris Johnson era. In fact, in the Boris Johnson era, you had ministers going on the broadcast rounds defending their colleagues, only for those colleagues to be sacked or to resign hours or days later. So it has been dealt with more swiftly than that. But there are serious questions about what Rishi Sunak knew when. These complaints date back many, many years. You'd have thought that it was something that he would consider when appointing Raab, not just to be Justice Secretary, but indeed Deputy Prime Minister in the first place. He has lost a number of ministers, Gavin Williamson and Nadhim Zahawi, of course, and he has also lost a key ally on the Tory Brexity right, which is what Dominic Raab represents. So in a way, Sunak can say that he has maintained credibility and integrity by acting as quickly as he has done, but questions still very much remain, and I think there'll be a lot of anger within the party at the way this has played out.
A final broader thought, because civil servants, senior civil servants, so crucial, critical in day-to-day running of government. You have a situation at the moment where an investigation can only actually begin if the Prime Minister says, yes, it can. Does the whole system need to be overhauled, do you think?
There are very serious questions about that. One of the things that comes out in the report is to what extent ministers can or should act as line managers to civil servants, and whether the correct workplace structures are in place to enable that to work well. But fundamentally, if ministers don't have a good relationship with the civil servants in their department, that is going to have an impact on policy and operational and development issues, and it's going to seriously hold things back. I think for too long we've had this idea that the civil service is somehow an obstacle. It's at war with the government. The vast majority of civil servants are incredibly decent, hard-working people. They want to do a good job. They want to get the job done. They're not able to do that if the relationship with ministers perpetually becomes so antagonistic.
Rachel Cunliffe, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for being here on the programme live there from Westminster. We saw it in our piece from Ian Watson, just looking at some of the key findings, and we've seen what Dominic Raab has said about the inquiry, describing it as unfair. But our reporter Courtney Bembridge has been going through the key findings of the report, pulling out the critical details. So let's get more on terms of the conclusions of today's report.
Well, this is the report. It's 48 pages long and is very dense. And if we can have a look at the key question in all of this, the definition of bullying, it defines bullying as intimidating or insulting behaviour that makes an individual feel uncomfortable, frightened, less respected or put down. And there are many examples of Dominic Raab's behaviour that go to this key question of whether it was bullying. Let's have a look at some of these ones. It talks about him in meetings with policy officials acting in a manner which was intimidating in the sense of going further than was necessary or appropriate in delivering critical feedback, and also insulting in the sense of making unconstructive critical comments about the quality of work done. And it talks a lot about Dominic Raab's frustration at some of the ways that information was being given to him in some of these briefings. He talks about asking for the basics, the basic information, and when he feels that that wasn't being given to him by officials, that he was accusing them of obstructiveness, and he described some of their work as utterly useless and of woeful. The report, however, goes on to say that the Deputy Prime Minister did not intend, by the conduct described, to upset or humiliate, nor did he target anyone for a specific type of treatment. So that's some of the allegations here. There's also more, if we look at the findings here. The findings state that the conduct cannot be characterised as offensive, malicious or insulting. It was experienced as intimidating in the sense of excessively demanding, but the report's author notes, I could not make a finding as to whether it was in fact intimidating in this sense. There was no evidence to suggest any abuse or misuse of power. So obviously we're going through this report line by line in the BBC newsroom, and we'll have more updates for you throughout the day.
Very interesting to see some of the lines there in that report. Let me take you back to Downing Street, because we are monitoring the situation. We've had that small reshuffle, a new Deputy Prime Minister, a new Justice Secretary. So we continue to monitor events there, and we'll bring you more reaction throughout the course of the programme. This major story with so many questions being thrown up. So do stay with us. We'll have plenty more live from Westminster. Around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News.